Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. Thanks to you, this is the 136th TNT Show, and Indie Live is growing and delivering more exciting shows. You can watch the TNT Show, for example, on indielive.net. It's streamed out on YouTube, on Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter. Plus, on YouTube, you can view all the previous 135 shows. So if you're interested in senior academics, movie stars, science correspondents, and, dare I say it, journalists, then they'll all feature in that range of 130 odd shows. And talking about journalism, if you're upset by media coverage of political events, where journalism is often junked in favour of stenography or rehashed news releases, if you're looking for an alternative voice, well, you found it. We're here for you. And now's your chance to be here for us, please. It would be fantastic if you could support the crowdfunder when the details appear on the screen. Well, it's been another great day for British democracy. We learned that the UK lost over £58 billion to fraud. Now, just think about that. The next time a minister says there's no money for doctors, train staff, and many, many other deserving cases and employment professions, £58 billion has gone astray. It's fraud. It's a criminal offence, and yet it's gone and may never be recovered. Tonight we're talking to two excellent interviewees. Among the subjects we'll be covering tonight are English identity and a democratic system of government for England, with former Labour MP John Denham, now Professor at Southampton University, plus the idea of a League of Union of the Isles with Glyndwr Jones, who you may recall was on a previous show. Perhaps Glyndwr might be persuaded to comment about a statement from a Welsh Conservative today that Welsh people have lower IQs. She says, I'm sorry, but it's a fact. And that a Tory councillor today has said that all white men should have a black man or woman as a slave. And when asked why, he explained it's because they're a lower class than us. And we'll be taking your questions live, and there's still time to get your question considered. You'll see the details on the screen shortly. TNT, as you know, stands for The Nation Talks. So this is your show. We're live and we're free. So no license, no problem. Now to our guests, John Denham and Glyndwr Jones. Thanks for joining us, gentlemen. How are you? Starting with Glyndwr. What do you make of these comments, Glyndwr?
I wouldn't dignify them with a response. Disgraceful. I'm very well, thank you. And visiting friends in North Wales. The weather's a little interesting, but glad to be with you again. Thank you, John.
What is it about the British who need to understate the weather conditions? Strange one. John, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Pleased to be on the show. I'm talking to you from Winchester, where I think we've actually have shared very much the same sort of weather today. Very record winds off the Isle of Wight and whatever, but it's good to have the conversation.
Well, you know, these poor weather conditions are exclusive to the UK. I checked just before we came on the show. Partly of Europe is basking in sunshine as we speak. And that's the reality of living in an island. You never know what the weather's going to be like from one moment to the next. John, you're the director of the Centre for English Identity and Politics. Why is such a centre needed? Because a lot of people must be thinking, I know what English identity is, and I know what English politics is. I don't need a centre to tell me.
Yes, there's two reasons. One is that most of the people who say that actually are wrong in most of the assumptions that they make about English identity. So you'll find phrases thrown around like English nationalism without any definition of what people mean or inquiring into the evidence. But fundamentally, it's because if you talk about the politics of Scotland or of Wales or of Northern Ireland or of most other nations, the idea that national identity, ideas of the nation, plays a role in politics is taken for granted. Nobody would dream of writing, I think, about Scottish politics without taking Scottish ideas of contested ideas, if you like, of the Scottish nation into account. Yet when people talk about England, They talk about class, they talk about values, they talk about demography. They never talk about national identities. Yet, over the last 20 years, national identity in England has reshaped the politics of England, and it's actually reshaped the politics of the United Kingdom as well. So, I mean, I won't do the whole lecture, but just briefly, 20 years ago, it didn't make much difference in England whether you said you were more English than British, equally English than British, or more British than English. Yet, actually, as time went on, it was the people who emphasized their English identity who provided the bulk of the Leave votes that took the whole of the UK out of the EU. It was the same voters who in 2019, in the Get Brexit Done election, elected Boris Johnson's UK majority of 80, but that depended on an English majority of 156. And yet in the 2019 election, the people who are more British than English actually voted for Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. The voted for Boris Johnson. The people who are more British than English tended to vote Remain. So you have this polarization of the politics of national identity in England, which I would say too few people understand or even talk about. And secondly, it's not just English identity that matters, it's British identity, because ideas of being British that you find in England are different to the ideas of Britishness that you'll find in Scotland or in Wales. So, for example, somebody in England who says, I'm British, not English, will have on most issues polar opposite politics to somebody who says, I'm British, not Scottish in Scotland, or somebody who says, I'm British, not Welsh in Wales. So even the British, sort of, if you like, self-evidently being English is not the same as being Welsh or being Scottish, but actually to be British in English in England is not the same as being British in Wales or Scotland. So I think we should talk about these things more. I think we shouldn't have crude assumptions about how national identity politics works. And this is clearly a big debate. Well, it should be a big debate in England. It's not the debate I'd like it to be. But these things have reshaped the politics of the whole of the United Kingdom. So everybody should be taking more interest in them.
In the light of what you've just said, and also thinking about your political background, how do you feel about the Labour leader wrapping himself in the flag, the Union flag? Because to many people outside England, it looks very odd.
Yeah. I mean, I think that at one level, there is a level of what you could call performative patriotism, which it's there. It's the respect for the symbols of the nation are part of the political. You don't get elected because of it, but you can certainly get elected if you don't actually show some sort of performative patriotism. Where I disagree strongly with Keir is that Keir imagines that when he talks about Britain rather than about England, he's speaking for the whole of the Union. I think Keir genuinely believes that by talking about Britain, he is increasing the strength of Welsh Labour or of Scottish Labour and of winning people in Scotland over to the Labour Party. Whereas my understanding is it either leaves people cold or positively alienates people.
Yeah.
And my worry is that, I mean, this is where Glyndwr and I agree. Instead of thinking of ourselves as a multi-nation union, right, we talk in a very Anglo-centric way as though England and Britain are really the same thing. And so you'll find with frontbench Labour politicians, they will announce a policy for England because it's a devolved matter. So if you're the English Shadow Secretary of State, you're only talking about English schools. You're not talking about Welsh schools or Scottish schools. They will announce a schools policy and they say, we're going to make Britain's schools better. So in complete sort of ignorance of the devolution settlement, but also confusing England with Britain. And I think that's actually, because I regard myself as a unionist, or a very different type of unionist, but I think that's bad for the union. I think it's also bad for England because it means the Labour Party doesn't speak to England as England, even on that huge range of issues: higher education, skills, childcare, transport, which are England-only issues.
In the light of that, Glyndwr, what's your comment? What's your reaction to what John has just said?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, identity plays an enormous factor in people's not just relationships, but also political leanings. And can I pick up on the point of England? It endures as the most highly centralised country in Europe. Limited powers assigned to the mayors, and the combined local authorities do not compensate at all for the centrist culture that we see in Westminster and Whitehall. 20 years after English domestic policy on health, education, transport, social care, and agriculture was separated from the devolved nations, these policies remain the responsibility of the UK government. And England has not a senior minister nor a committee of ministers that is responsible for coordinating national policy on an England level. So this does result, as John has just outlined, in a UK government comprising many ministers whose responsibilities rest almost exclusively within England, and yet the cabinet itself lacks a discrete England focus as a territory. And the situation is compounded, if you look at it from a Scottish or Welsh perspective, is compounded by the role of the UK Prime Minister, who effectively doubles as the English First Minister and introduces a whole host of conflicts of interest into decision making. I can take one example just to illustrate the challenges. UK government continues to classify HS2 as an England and Wales project, despite no track being laid in Wales, leading to the absence of any additional Barnett formula funds to the nation, which could reach in the order of £5 billion if a fair settlement was looked at. So these challenges in the governance of England and its setting within a UK governmental context has ripples, has effects to not just, the governance and the good governance of England itself, but also to Scotland, Wales, and current challenges in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, and John made an interesting point about identity, and I think you've said in the past a similar sort of thing. I spend time in the States, and lots of people there say, I'm Italian American, I'm Irish American. For example, if we were in Ireland right now, and I said to Joe Biden, well, what are you, Joe? He would say, I'm an Irish American. And he would say it without any reservations. It wouldn't be a big deal thing. In fact, electorally, as far as the East Coast in particular is concerned, Massachusetts, New England, that would be a very appropriate thing to say because the Democratic Party and the connections with the Irish diaspora. But nobody sees that as problematic. No, they're Italian American, Irish American, whatever. And has that come out of the enormous turmoil that has taken place in the States, civil wars and all the rest of it? Because the reason I say that is there is a theory that we've had people on the show expound, which is that the reason that Britain has problems of identity, etc., is because there hasn't been a major convulsion of any kind, like the French Revolution, Russian Revolution, and therefore, like Topsy, it just sort of growed and bits were stuck on here, there, and everywhere. What do you think of that sort of analysis? Does that make sense to you?
I can see the argument, but I'd take a different view. I think that for a long time there was an asymmetrical constitutional settlement that sort of broadly worked, and at the time when England was at the heart of union and it was the heart of empire, it was possible both to argue that, obviously not for everybody, but for many people, the empire worked in terms of wealth, both the business class, the industrialization of Scotland, Wales, the mines that produced the coal that powered the empire, all of that sort of stuff. Within that context, England was able to imagine the Union was essentially an extension of England. So essentially, the Union Parliament was an extension of the English Parliament. The interests of the Union were the same as those of England. And within that, due recognition was made to the fact that people in Wales, with their own church and language acts and in the Scottish legal system, saw the Union differently. They tended to see the Union as something that respected their national identity. Well, these are completely sort of like contradictory views of the Union, but they worked as long as the common interests of empire and of a national economy held us together. And I would just say that what's really happened since the post-war period is the unraveling of that asymmetric constitution. And what we've got to so far is a degree of autonomy for Wales and Scotland, in a different context, Northern Ireland. And England is left in this unresolved position where the assumptions of the English political establishment are still Anglo-centric unionism. Still, and this is why Keir talks about Britain, not England, still the assumption that if you talk about England, you're talking about Britain and vice versa. And that, I think, is the difficulty. So you've had a process of, I don't agree, but national formation in Wales and Scotland, the development of national political spaces. I'm not saying the questions have been resolved. Self-evidently, they haven't been.
No, they haven't.
You've had this development of a national space. Nothing equivalent of that sort has taken place in England. So it's a different question to, if you like, hyphenated identities. And I think the current problem is that, one way of putting it, England's the only part of the United Kingdom not to have had a national debate or a referendum about what its constitutional position should be. And it has no institutions in which that can take place. And as Glyndwr said, it's not just that England self-evidently doesn't have a parliament, there's no machinery of government. England is run by the UK government, and that means dominated by the UK Treasury. So I think that, part of what I'm interested in is, how do we resolve that problem of enabling England to feel at home with itself being an English nation that belongs to a union, not an England that thinks it can run the union?
I'd like to come back to that in a second, if I may, but if I could ask you, Glyndwr, I assume that you accept most of what John has just said, because it's self-evidently the case. Is there anything you want to add to that? Because I want to ask you, I want to take a couple of questions, but before I do that, I'd like to ask you if what John has said connects with your view on a league stroke union of the Isles. And that was what John has recommended or suggested would have to happen before your proposal could take shape.
Well, England comprises over 56 million people, more than 5 times the total number living in the UK, other UK nations combined. And it still lacks, as John has highlighted, a discrete national institution through which its internal inequities may be addressed. In terms of wealth, status, power, and population, it is orientated heavily towards the south, producing almost 22% of the UK's total output. London acts as a strong centripetal force, undermining the position of the English regions generally. There is a compelling case for a need for change and reform. But, all unitary states, such as the UK, face ongoing challenges in acknowledging the partial autonomy and diversity of the constituent nations, and especially in sustaining a sense of belonging to the larger political body. The makeup of individuals' identities, as we've touched on, is complex and partly comprises their beliefs, social affiliations, and relationships within territorial groupings. And if people sense that these qualities are not treated by central bodies with equal dignity and respect, then they are likely to experience the circumstances of government as unsatisfactory. And if we just roll ahead to the present time, indeed, the UK's withdrawal from one union, the European Union, has intensified debates in Scotland and Wales about whether it should lead to their departure of their territories from another union, the United Kingdom. And the situation of Northern Ireland is more complicated. But these are the contexts that are now pressing more heavily on us. But if the unitary state, or those who are advocating a strong, close unitary state, remain inflexible.
I'd like to take a couple of questions, if I may. One question is about unionists accuse nationalists of promoting division, but doesn't politics by its very nature end up being divisive?
Well, I mean, I don't talk that language. By the way, so John, you just said, in response to what I said earlier, you said that was self-evident. I have to tell you, to most of my colleagues in England, what I said, it is not self-evident. Actually, trying to persuade people that confusing England and Britain is a problem is actually an uphill task. So I'm glad it's.
I agree. I agree.
I live in a politics.
I was looking at it from a philosophical point of view, rather than political.
Yeah, I mean, look, it seems to me that I mean, I root the rise of nationalism much more in the unraveling of a type of state, a type of economy and society that worked previously under conditions that are not coming back. So we're not going to go back to empire. I very much doubt it, and I certainly hope not. And secondly, the idea of a British national economy in which you had a British ruling class, broadly business class, reflected by the conservatives across the island of Britain, and a unified labour movement. That type of economy has unraveled, and I see the rise of nationalism, the rise of national identity politics as an inevitable response to those changing underlying circumstances. So I think the idea that nationalists promote division and unionists don't, it's just a silly debate. Into what we're seeking, I think, is a way in which we can have the best functioning society and an economy that gives expression to people's legitimate sense of national identity and national democracy. And that's, both sides can argue and should argue that theirs is the best route to that. Yeah. But I don't think the idea that one side is in favor of division, the other one isn't, is a healthy or particularly useful way of looking at the question.
You say that, John, but in the last week we've seen the Labour Party, and I don't understand why they're first in the field here, because I would have thought the government would have been first to do this, but launch a series of ads which are ad hominem attacks. So the questioner, it seems to me, has some force in his argument. He said politics essentially politics is becoming more divisive. If we go down the American route, I mean, the American route, when I go to the United States, there's very little rational debate of the kind that you and Glyndwr have just advocated. What's replaced it is a bunch of attack ads saying things like Glyndwr believes that murderers should not be hanged. Yeah. Stuff like this, and you think, oh, hold on a second, this is what he actually said. But what you've done is you've edited his remarks in such a way that he looks like he's some sort of apologist for mass rape and stuff like this, and you think.
So let me come back on that. Firstly, I was very critical of the first of the attack ads, which was the one about child sexual abuse, partly because of the assertion it made about Sunak, but largely I actually think as a progressive, entering a bidding war about criminal sentencing policy leads to bad policy in government, because actually there may be circumstances like an 18-year-old who persuaded a 15-year-old to send an indecent picture on the mobile phone didn't get sent to jail. Are we really getting in a position of saying they should have been sent to jail when you're actually dealing with a social and educational issue more than a sort of cynical paedophile pervert who undoubtedly should be in jail? So I didn't like that ad. The idea of attack ads per se, I've got to say, if you've been a Labour politician like me for 50 years, you've had 50 years of the other side having to attack ads against you.
Precisely why I said what I said.
I don't quite join the idea that we're lowering the tone of politics.
So, I did make that qualifier at the beginning.
I think we can debate the individual ads. Yeah. I think the idea of actually saying, look, the Tories can't change their leader every 6 months and pretend that everything else they've ever done didn't count, which is the sort of politics of Sunak at the moment.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting point. There are two issues that immediately crop up in the light of your joint remarks, and I want to take them in turn. One is that, and I think, Glyndwr, we touched upon this when you were on the show earlier, previously, if these issues don't get addressed, and I'm thinking particularly of Wales now, rather than Scotland, but Scotland is the model, if you like. If these issues don't get addressed, then what tends to happen is you tend to move towards polarisation. And what's happened in Scotland is it's very difficult to find any middle ground anymore, because people are now classified as being one thing or the other, which is a real danger for, it seems to me, for Wales, if you're arguing for a sort of middle position, as it were, constitutionally. In fact, that's a very sort of odd way to put it, but I think you know what I mean, which is that if you don't address these things, if you don't address these things, you end up in a much worse situation than you would have done had you addressed them. Because what you've done is you've left the middle ground to anyone who comes along and says, look, here's my attack ad of today. So my question is, do you still agree with that, or do you feel that things in Wales have moved on a little bit and there's much more scope for a discussion about constitutional change that doesn't involve independence for Wales?
Well, the UK is becoming increasingly diverse, culturally, legally, and politically, and a widely accepted approach to successfully embracing such variations is to revise the nature of governance. And in today's world, nearly 200 states are underpinned by written constitutions, and surprisingly, the UK is not. So, establishing a written framework for these isles with the support of the 4 parliaments could prove invaluable across the political spectrum.
Can I just test?
Test.
I just want to test that for a bit. Yeah. We have a situation with the Labour Party, which you have to, I think, accept as a much more progressive outfit than the main opposition, the government right now. But they've laboured for, if you'll excuse the pun, for 100 years to reform the House of Lords, or abolish it, I think was the original plan. But it's still there, and Labour still appoint people to an unelected body that makes laws. Now, I mean, the House of Lords is one of the few elected chambers in the world where people are able to make laws based on their religion. I think the only other areas where that applies would be in Iran. That doesn't sound democratic. It doesn't sound like any sort of reform has taken place over that century. So why would you believe that somehow this institution, which can't even reform one little part of them, one major part, but not the elected part of it, can somehow take on board all the other things that would need to happen in order to bring about what you would advocate?
So I have a go. See, I think the reality is that there are a number of different forces that are combining to make people look at these questions differently. Yes. So it's not, if you like, a starting from scratch intellectual problem. Now, so one is that probably a more likely outcome than the breakup of the United Kingdom is permanent union miserabilism, where very large numbers in Scotland would like to have independence, but a crucial group of people daren't do it because they worry about the consequences. Wales, you have a growing indie curiousness, dissatisfaction with the union. Carwyn James said some time ago, the hold of the union has been broken. Northern Ireland could well be, for a long period of time, one in which the unionists lose their majority, but there's no majority for a border poll. Over half the population of England aren't really committed to the union. We could go on for years in permanent miserabilism. So that's one driver. A second driver, going back to your very opening, £58 billion goes missing during COVID. Well, okay, let's blame the Tories. Actually, no, let's actually blame the fact that England doesn't have an effective government and an effective state. The rump union state that runs England is very bad at the job. Okay, it can't devolve power. It can't build a regionally equitable economy. It can't tackle the problems of dominance of the financial centres that Glyndwr was talking about earlier. So even if you have no interest in nation in England, you have an interest in how badly we're governed. And then you've got the electoral system. Part of our problem is we have an electoral system that magnifies the difference between the nations, overrepresents the Conservatives in England, the nationalists in Scotland, or whether within Westminster. So all sorts of people are beginning to put the picture together from different starting points. We can't go on like this. And
sorry, John, where's the evidence of that? Because we've had others on the show tell us exactly the same thing.
Yeah,
give me the evidence.
Okay, just these. I know this is like the weeds of academia, but just this week, another report has come out by the Bennett Institute at Cambridge, the Institute of Government, saying you cannot carry on with England not being properly governed at the centre like it is now. I've been around this field for 10 years. Nobody was writing reports like that 5 years ago. Certainly weren't writing it 10 years ago. So people who are approaching this from a question of democratic governance, economic efficiency, are coming to the same conclusion
I hear
as
what
the
you're
old
saying.
campaigners for
Let me take up one of those points. Approaching it from a democratic position. The democratic position in Scotland is that the Scottish Parliament would like to have a referendum.
Yeah.
And they're being refused that.
Yeah.
Now, I'll be flippant for a second. There's a good argument for having a referendum right now. If I was sitting in Westminster, I would be saying, guys,
another generation.
You want a referendum? You can have it tomorrow morning. And I'll be right there supporting you to the hilt. But leaving that aside, both parties in Westminster have said, no way. It can't happen right now, but no way. Keir Starmer has said, no way, it's not going to happen. So what you're saying to people is that our belief in democracy stops at the border. That's a strange argument.
I'm not, because I wouldn't take that position. And you've got to say, I'm a former Labour MP, former Labour minister, and I'm still a Labour Party member, but I'm not here as a spokesman for the Labour Party. What I find really incomprehensible is that in Wales, we have seen a form of progressive Labour politics, which has managed to blend progressiveness with an idea of a national political space. Right. In Wales, you actually have a Labour Party that cooperates with nationalists, utterly different to Scotland. Now, I think there are more lessons for the Labour Party to learn from Wales than there are from the Labour Party in Scotland, which seems to me to be trying to occupy a ground of trying to maximise the unionist vote for Labour rather than to shape a Scottish Labour vote that it once had. Now, I've lived almost my entire life within a mile and a half of the south coast, so I'm very cautious about commenting on Scottish politics. But from that distance, it looks a bit strange. So yeah, you can point out all sorts of places where you can say, well, that change hasn't happened yet. That change happened yet. All I'm saying is that around the circles in which I discuss these things, there are more people engaged, both in the idea, as Glyndwr is talking about, a union which is comprised of sovereign nations that are working together than there were a few years ago.
Okay. Yeah, I concur entirely with John Denham on this. There are far more discussions, far more reports being produced about the situation in England now than ever, and the analyses and the sense of urgency to improve the governance arrangements within England itself. Personally, I feel will become the driver for more substantial constitutional change across these isles. The challenge, John, I'd mentioned in our previous interview, was that too many of our conversations are framed as within individual countries rather than us as a group, as neighbours. If we continually frame the conversation as just Wales, just Scotland, or the situation in Northern Ireland, then we're not really looking at how we can work collaboratively, how we can harmonise laws in a way that allow us to successfully build a future together as isle-wide peoples. But I will challenge the whole premise of one country moving off and separate and becoming separate.
Very good point. And also, John's earlier point I thought was very good too. I'd just like to say, how can you ever hope to achieve what you've just said if you can't even agree upon what is democracy? I mean, for example, the previous question is not to be put to one side. You have a situation where a sovereign parliament, well, to the extent that anything can be sovereign, it's not Westminster, made a decision, and that decision is not being honoured. I mean, it just seems to me that if you can't even agree upon the fundamentals, how can you possibly hope to agree upon anything else?
I'm not going to argue with you that there has to be a legal route to independence for any part of the United Kingdom. Now, we have actually set that out in the context of Northern Ireland, not to independence for Northern Ireland, but for the possibility of reunification in Ireland. So you cannot just say no. So I'm not going to say, I'm not saying that You just say, well, you can't. That's not a sort of grown-up response to the politics of Scotland. Probably most people would say, well, we can't have a referendum every 18 months in the hope of winning one at some point. So, there's a discussion to be had about what that route is, but I'm not going to argue with you about the principle of having being able to decide on the future of any part of the United Kingdom. But I would also say it's not the only debate that we should be having. Those of us who want to say, well, actually, maybe the option of saying we are four sovereign nations that decide to pool some of our functions, whether it's on the particular model that's being put forward or we work there and get there in a different way, that vision is worth considering as well, and shouldn't necessarily be ruled out as something that's not in the discussion.
Yeah, Glyndwr?
Yes, look, that's a very important point. Sovereign nations, that is independence. I mean, the European Union, that's a confederation. No one says that France or Germany are not independent. The model which I've put out there in the League Union of the Isles is just a proposition. It talks about a Council of Isles whose members are elected typically for a 4-year period, being responsible for powers such as defence, diplomacy, internal trade, currency, macroeconomics, and with a committee of member nations convening regularly to discuss other areas that demand some collaboration and harmonisation of laws. Head of the Confederation, would continue to be the British monarch to balance change with continuity and holding frequent audiences with the nation's first ministers. And the National Parliament, of course, would automatically assume every power that's not delegated to.
I think I was making a larger point, perhaps, which is that the longer, and it seems to me this is a real danger, and maybe not everyone outside of Scotland understands this fully. There is a real problem with denying democracy and saying, well, we'll get round to fixing it once we've done some other stuff. I think what happens when you go down that route, you create a major, it's almost a constitutional hole. And you make it so easy for any eventual result to be less harmonious than would be the case, accepting totally what you just said. If you've got an island, you can conceive of sovereign nations. They would have to cooperate. There will be no question about that. You cannot run a physical island and not have massive cooperation amongst the major components of it. But as one of our questioners has pointed out, one of the challenges would be in England, because as soon as you start to talk about, we're going to have these major groups working together, and the king will have regular meetings with the heads of state, etc., etc., etc. You get people in the north of England saying, hey, hold on a second, buddy. This is okay for you Welsh and Scots and Irish, but what about us in the north?
Well,
we feel just as alienated as you do, and nobody's talking about us or to us. Meantime, you guys are off having all these discussions about democracy and all the rest of it. Who's going to look after us?
That's not really the difficulty it sounds. I mean, firstly, I think let's accept that there has to be a legal route to independence, but let's look at other changes. One of the things we could start to do quite straightforwardly is to unpick the governance of England from that of the United Kingdom. Yeah. So that you actually have a civil service structure. You actually have a way of making laws, which means that those things are dealt with in England, have a proper English government. I mean, people don't realize there is no English government. You can't go to Whitehall and say, who coordinates the government of England? It doesn't exist. You have these disparate UK things. Now, if you do that, firstly, that will make devolution within England a lot easier. The reason that devolution doesn't take place is that England is run by the UK Treasury, and the UK Treasury is centralizing, instinctively cautious, won't let go of power, and always blocks devolution. So if we just had a machinery of government, then perhaps the Secretary of State for England, then you get into a situation where in intra-governmental talks, instead of the governments of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland being confronted by the UK government saying, well, this moment I'm England, this moment I'm the UK, whichever suits me, you actually have England clearly represented and separately. So you then have to have a structure which is the UK meeting together and resolving the different interests and the different interests of size, whatever. Now, I actually think the regional issue within England is actually is resolved primarily by radical devolution within England. Right, that resentment in the northeast or the northwest will continue for as long as power is hoarded by an incompetent civil service in Whitehall. Right, but once you unlock devolution, which you can have by having English machinery of government, then I think you will find, I mean, those regional identities will remain enormously important. But my understanding is that Scotland has regional identities within Scotland that are hugely important to people, but they don't seem to get in the way of talking about the future of Scotland as a nation. And I think England would be very much the same. To be from the West Country, which is where I'm from, would be different to being a Geordie, but you could actually be still part of that English nation with a decent English government.
It's an interesting, I mean, I look at it from the perspective of, we've had Professor Danny Dorling on the show.
Oh, yeah.
And Danny's view is that all of this is caused by the empire and the fact that it wasn't dealt with properly back then, not so much by the other nations, but by England. England never came to terms with England. It's always been avoided, and all sorts of sophistries were involved, like effectively calling England Britain, that somehow, you know, that dealt with it.
Yeah, Danny's wrong on this, actually. But
you think so? I'll tell him when
Danny, who I know. He overstates the case, and he tends to lump the guilt of empire onto the English. Well, I'm pretty sure somewhere it was called the British Empire, and I think there were a few Scots and Irish and Welsh in there as well.
And Welsh as well. I remember doing some work with HSBC, and somebody, actually the chairman, a guy called Willie Purvis, the chairman, chief executive, said to me, "You know why HSBC is so called?" I said, "No, I don't know. I thought it was a Hong Kong and No. He says, "That's just for official purposes. It actually stands for a home for Scottish bank clerks."
Oh, no.
Yeah. So compared to Danny, there are lingering issues about the empire. I don't think they're exclusive to the English. But actually, where he is right, or where we agree, is we are dealing with the unresolved legacies of an imperial constitution, right? And so the logical end of the imperial constitution was to move towards what both of your guests are talking about, which is a union of sovereign nations. And what New Labour got to in the 1970s is they tried to do a bit of it without working out where the end came.
That was because of SNP pressure, I suspect, more than anything else. I didn't detect any great conviction there. What I got was a sense of, well, we have to do something.
The assumption, because I've written about this, was there were people like Donald Dewar, who I liked enormously, who was a man of conviction. And I think he was somebody who saw a sort of Labour vision of Scotland as Scotland. For others, like George Robinson, who famously said, you know, it'll kill nationalism stone dead, it was a transactional move to release tensions. And for UK Labour, as you know, the Labour Party in government, Tony Blair and so on, this was just seen as a sideshow issue. They had been told that if you do this, nationalism will go away. So in other words, you had everything from real deep conviction politics, which I knew Donald a bit before the 97 election, and he absolutely was passionate in his Scottishness and his vision. And there were others who were quite just totally transactional about it. And there wasn't a vision. The discussion we're having tonight really is, what was the vision that should have been there in 1997 about where this process ends up? And we've frozen.
I'll give you an example of how problematic it is in practice. After the 2014 referendum, there was something called the Smith Commission. And its top priority was to create a Scottish Parliament that was sovereign, i.e. was independent, they said, i.e. could not be abolished. And I thought, well, this is nuts. I mean, no disrespect to any of the folks involved. You cannot have within the same state two sovereign entities. That's a non sequitur. And the fact that they thought that was a way to deal with the problem struck me as indication of a very shallow understanding of what constitutions are and what they mean to people. And of course it failed, because we now have a situation right now where the Scottish government is appealing against a decision by the Secretary of State to overrule a piece of legislation which has its critics and its adherents, which was passed by an overwhelming majority of all the parties in the Scottish Parliament. So people are looking at that. And furthermore, the Secretary of State, despite repeated requests, failed to say what his issues, i.e. the issues that the Westminster government has with that legislation are.
Yeah.
So, in other words, the people who are in a position to amend it cannot amend it because they don't know what the problem is.
And this surely... Sorry, Glyndwr.
John, no, this has been going on for much longer. I mean, the legislative powers delegated to Wales and Scotland, they have been consistently undermined by Westminster in recent years. Bills that Wales and Scotland have withheld legislative consent include the European Union withdrawal agreement and future relationship bills, the UK internal market bill, the subsidy control and professional qualifications bills. They go on endlessly. This is not just what's going on more recently. It is time for Westminster to accept that having effectively transferred sovereignty for prescribed areas of government to the nations, it cannot then, on the pretext of absolute sovereignty of the UK Parliament, decide to overrule them. Simply imposing its own policies on matters devolved is not a sustainable option. The system is not working, or it's operating badly at best. So despite there was an intergovernmental review even at the start of 2022, which was meant to sort this, but it's shown little sign of improving matters. So,
but you're underscoring my earlier point.
I also just finished this. We are also in a position where there's a Governor of Wales bill going through from the House of Lords to ensure that powers devolved to the Cennydd cannot be amended or withdrawn by the UK government without a supermajority vote of elected members in Cardiff. So we are in a space where the discomfort in the devolved nations, along with this pressing need to improve matters in England, is moving us towards an opportunity. I see it, an opportunity where we can have the franker discussions about how do we define sovereignty? How do we look at those shared functions? And this is what we, I think, is where John Denham and I.
So we have two understanding.
If I put a point to you, but particularly to you, John, I mean, I lived in Berkshire for 20 years, and I would have found it quite difficult to try and convince my neighbours that they should go through a period of major constitutional change that would, on the face of it, bring the benefits to Wales and Northern Ireland and Scotland. But I would have difficulty seeing those advantages for me in Berkshire. How would you sell that? Because right now I'm perfectly happy with what I got. Why should
I would start two things. I would start the English conversation from the problems of English governance. I would say to people of Berkshire, why is the health service in such a bad state? Why did 58 billion pounds go missing during COVID? Why is the HS2 neither going to reach Birmingham, nor London, nor Manchester, nor anywhere? Because the state is unable to develop. So I would actually say, let's have a discussion about how England is governed. Well, the first thing is, where's the government of England? You can't show me a government of England, right? There is no minister who is accountable for delivery in England. So the English conversation, I would start from England. But once you start from actually saying, let's delineate the government of England from that of the Union, you then are into a discussion about, well, what's the Union going to look like when you've got Scotland, Wales, and so that's what we do. And then going back to the discussion we've just been having, that then throws up the shallowness of our constitutional debate. I had the privilege recently of giving evidence to a Scottish Parliament committee looking at devolution after Brexit. And I made the very simple point, people talking about the Sewell Convention being breached. I mean, the Sewell Convention was invented when we did devolution, when we were a member of the European Union. And had we tried to do devolution when we were outside the European Union, nobody would have thought something as flimsy as the Sewell Convention could possibly define the relationships between the different parliaments. Well, now we have to. We're outside the European Union. We've got to answer these very, very difficult questions. So, yeah, you can start your Berkshire question in Berkshire. But that will lead to a way of looking at England, which then opens up the rest of the constitutional discussion. I don't expect people in Scotland to start the debate anywhere else apart from what's in the interests of Scotland. But then that leaves you
But
about the
with
union.
respect, what you are asking people in Scotland to do is to wait until that discussion takes place. And I just don't, and also the people in Wales. I mean, how effective would that be? Do you think, Glyndwr? Let's stop any more discussion here until England gets itself sorted out. How would that play in Wales?
Well, I think from a Welsh perspective, and certainly from my perspective, we do need to frame the conversations in a way that allows us to talk about collaboration, talks about pooling aspects that we share, those interests that we importantly share as Isle-wide peoples, to a central body. Okay, if we start talking in those terms, and if we understand that there are drivers within England itself, by far the larger proportion of the population of these islands, then we can start talking about conversations about sovereignty. Where does sovereignty ultimately reside? Is it at Westminster, or should it be devolved? Should it be assigned to the nations individually, who then assign it to the centre? Devolution, I think I've mentioned or summarised crudely before, involves a sovereign Westminster delegating a measure of sovereign authority to the devolved institutions. Confederalism, and I think this is what we're sort of touching on here, turns this approach on its head. It advocates 4 sovereign nations of radically different population sizes, as we're sort of experiencing in the UK, delegating some of this sovereign authority to central bodies in areas of common interest. It's in all our interests to talk to...
I hear what you're saying. Sorry, we're running out of time a little bit, so I need to very quickly ask this question. Isn't the stumbling block the fact that a confederal system works in Canada and elsewhere? I mean, you could almost argue the US is it's obviously a federation, but I mean, it works because they have a common constitution to which they all adhere.
Yeah.
There is no such thing in the UK. There is no written codified constitution where these issues have been adequately discussed and that the people have agreed upon them. And if you don't have that agreement, it's difficult to see how anything that results will be anything but piecemeal.
I think that there are 2 ways of looking at it. One is to have, if you like, the big constitutional moment, the Constitutional Convention that sits down and writes all these things down. That has its problems because everybody's got to agree they want to do that at the same time. But it's one approach. And there are things like deliberative participation, citizens' juries that can inform those sorts of things. Equally, you can have what I've always advocated is something called strategic incrementalism, where in a sense you say, do we have a broad picture of where we want to get to, right? In which case, let's take a series of measures that begin to move us further and further in that way. So you could argue that the devolution at the end of the 1990s was the beginning of such a process. The problem is there was no long-term vision. I think we could say, broadly, the vision of a union of sovereign nations is where we want to get to. Let's have measures that move us along in those sorts of directions. And I don't think this is a matter of saying to the people of Scotland, you've got to wait. I've made it clear, I think that people of Scotland have got the right to determine their own future. But there may be people in Scotland who would like to take part in that conversation. And I think they should be able to do so.
Yeah. I mean, the possible challenges to the Conservative and Labour parties is to become more formally representative of the nations within their organisational structures. The makeup of the Liberal Democrats is already federalised, and the strength of the various nationalist movements, of course, at a level uncommonly seen in other multinational states globally. However, and this is an important point also to go back to identity, Britishness as a concept is much older than the UK, and it's unrealistic to argue that the Scottish or Welsh people, for that matter, say in notional independent territories, would start considering the English as fellow Europeans instead of fellow English, fellow British, sorry. The challenge, therefore, is to capture our shared British ideals and values in a new framework which strengthens arrangements for self-government, was
Got
working
it,
with
got
a
it.
new isle-wide structure that is written and codified and understood by all.
You made that point very eloquently the last time you were on the show, and it's a very
Yes.
good point. But how would it stand the stresses? I mean, for example, there's an enormous number of people in Scotland who want no part of Trident.
Yeah.
They just don't want it. They certainly don't want it a few miles from their largest city. And that view was compounded when this week the UK government refused to make clear how many nuclear incidents had taken place there, because they felt it would befoul the relationship between the Scottish and Westminster governments. And you think, well, that's a crummy reason for doing it, perhaps. But you've got a situation there where, say, for example, the sovereign Scots decided they wanted to rejoin the EU, but the sovereign English state decided it didn't at all. And the Welsh decided they wanted to join. How would you fix that?
Every state is going to have these tensions, right? We have these tensions now, and we will have them in the future. And there will continue to be arguments. For example, people in Wales tend not to regard the Barnett formula as benignly as the people in Scotland have done, because it doesn't do so well by them, nor the ability in certain circumstances of Northern Ireland politicians to extract money for supporting Theresa May's government. So there will be finance issues. I mean, the question is, can you evolve a framework in which these sorts of issues can be resolved? Now, some people will take the view, John, I entirely accept, they cannot be resolved, and therefore the only route for Scotland is independence. And I don't think that is true, but I respect that view, and I wouldn't say to people you shouldn't argue that point of view. But what we're trying to say is, can you evolve a constitution that is better able to handle these inevitable difficulties and challenges? One of the biggest blocks is actually the current alignment of the UK parties. The Conservative Party is dominated by an assertive British nationalism, which insists on, assertive unionism. And that's what people in Scotland often call English nationalism, is actually assertive British nationalism by the Conservative Party. The Labour Party, to my regret, also does not actually acknowledge the territorial issues of England. And in a sense, we're in a position where, when I look at the polling about attitudes in England by different people towards the Union, towards England democracy, neither of our two major political parties adequately represent the way that people say they would wish to be governed. And that is one area where I don't hugely see immediate change, but I think in the campaigns for electoral reform and different types of democracy, you begin to see a challenge to that idea of monolithic union-wide parties.
Glyndwr, do you share that optimism?
I do. No, I certainly do. I can see the pressures are increasing, not just across Scotland, Wales. Also, we have the situation developing more in England, and it's imperative that we move forward and towards an informed debate on what kind of future will get the greatest possible traction across all elements of English, Scottish, Northern Irish, Welsh, and British society. The challenge of our time, and to repeat what I said earlier, is not so much that exploration of constitutional futures is not being had, but that it's been progressed separately within each nation rather than collectively as neighbours. The fact that Scotland is considering a second independence referendum so soon after its first poll, without constructively having had the opportunity in the intervening time to start engagement with an isle-wide convention or discussion of sorts, highlight the points. Constitutional reform, in my view, is unfinished business in the UK, and I agree entirely with John Denham on this, and will remain so until a fair and lasting settlement is explored. And I would propose a new social, economic and security partnership directed by a limited but mature political legislature along the lines of a confederal arrangement, where the sovereignty aspirations of the home nations are held sensitively and are dealt with in a way which also encourages all those interested to pool, share some key functions at a central level, such as macroeconomics, currency, and a whole host of other matters that are important to our future.
We've literally run out of time. I did say they all would go fast. I'd like to thank you both, gentlemen. It's been, we try to be educational, informative, and entertaining, and I think we've probably achieved all of that. I want to apologise to many of folks in our audience who had a whole raft of questions, but it seemed to me that we have to make a balance between the questions and what you have to say to us. And I've chosen to to let the conversation move onward. So I do apologise if you submitted a question that didn't get asked. I'd like you to please. I'd like to hope that you thought that what you heard tonight was helpful and useful, and the debate will continue. There's no question about that, because it's crucially important for all of us, because we're stuck on this little island together. So thank you again, gentlemen. If you can stick around for a few minutes, I'm going to make a few concluding remarks. But thank you very much. Well, there you are, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've enjoyed the show. A big thank you to John Denham and Glyndwr Jones. Just a reminder, please, to look out for my column in the Sunday National this weekend. You'll find it in the 7 Days supplement. And many, many thanks to all of you for your kind comments about the column on social media. It all helps. It helps me to convince the editor that even though much of my work is polemical, it also has some value in moving things forward. So to all of you watching and listening tonight across the world, and a big welcome to the show from let me get to Wesley Wiles, who is joining us from the United States. So thank you to all of you. Thanks for joining us. Stay safe and take care. And obviously, as I always say every week, do look out for the crowdfunder and do what you can to help Indie Live. Good night. Take care.